want to introduce our next speaker, Brian Orend. Brian is the Director of International Studies and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Waterloo in that rogue state to our North Canada. His PhD is from Columbia University, and his research and speaking efforts concentrate on three areas: the ethics of war and peace, human rights, and happiness. He's the author of 5 books, including 2 used widely as required texts at universities around the world: Human Rights, Concept and Context, and The Morality of War, which we use here. He is perhaps best known for his work on Jus Post Bellum, Justice in the Aftermath of War, which he will speak about today. And he has 2 forthcoming books: An Introduction to International Studies from Oxford and Seizure the Day, Happiness in Spite of Illness. Thank you, Brian, for coming again.
Thanks so much, Ed. Well, thank you so much, Ed. Thanks to everyone here at the Naval Academy, Jacqueline, Marge, George, for inviting me. It's a thrilling conference to be at. You know, this is one of these conferences that people are still going to remember and talk about, 5 or 10 years from now. Now, the subtitle, or the title of the conference is, well, War Making, War Ethics in the past 10 years. And there have been so many changes, so many interesting things happening in connection with wartime ethics in the past 10 years, and lots of people have discussed them, right? Asymmetrical warfare, torture, interrogation, drones, cyber war. Another thing that has kind of happened in the last 10 years, something very close to my heart, is that the subject of Jus Post Bellum at least makes the radar screen now, right? And of course, Jus Post Bellum refers to justice after war, justice in post-war situations. So I'm a just war theorist, inspired by Kant and Michael, John Rawls as well. And I'm a just war theorist even in spite of the fact that when I was in grad school, there was a very famous British philosopher who came to campus, and he asked me what I did, and I told him I work on just war theory. And he looked at me in total horror, and he said, "Surely you realize that is the very last refuge of scoundrels." And I was taken aback and wasn't expecting that. And so I said, "Well, I guess that makes me a scoundrel then." And he said, and he snorted. He literally snorted, and he said, "Indeed." And then he just walked away. But I persevered. I was in good company, right? I was in good company. I persevered. And essentially what I go around doing now is telling anyone who will listen that we need a new Geneva Convention. We need a brand new Geneva Convention exclusively devoted to issues of post-war justice. So why? Why? Well, I should point out, essentially my presentation is going to be broken into 2 parts. A theoretical part where I talk about post-war justice in general, and then a practical part where I try to answer the question, what, if anything, do we still owe Iraq and Afghanistan? So I'm going to talk about post-bellum principles in general, and then what, if anything, do we still owe Iraq and Afghanistan? Okay, so with the theoretical part, my main focus is that we need a new Geneva Convention exclusively devoted to Jus Post Bellum. Let me give you a bunch of good reasons why that is. First, we need it to complete the laws of war, right? As I'm sure you all know, there's tons of laws about regulating the outbreak of armed conflict, right? UN Charter, for example. And there are a ton of laws trying to regulate conduct within war, such as the other Geneva Conventions, right? But there is next to nothing. There is next to nothing regulating the endings of wars, right? Now, historically, I think this has been as a result of a conviction that, well, to the winner go the spoils of war. I think this is a deeply dangerous attitude. I think the endings of war should be regulated just as the beginnings of war and conduct during war. So we need a new Geneva Convention to complete the laws of war. Second, a practical thing, but I think a very important one, we need a new Geneva Convention to focus practical attention on the importance of this issue, right? To capture the imagination of decision makers, right? That this would be a great thing to talk about what we ought to do after we've won a war. Third, we need a new Geneva Convention to provide guidance, both for winners and for losers, right? And I stress both, right? Like we can see the benefits to the losers from having a Geneva Convention regulating post-war justice. Why? Because they'd be interested in being protected from the winners, right? And any draconian measures that they might impose. But even the winners have an interest in getting post-war guidance. There's a law prof at Harvard Law School. Her name is Gabriella Bloom, and she has this great concept called the fog of victory. Not just the fog of war, but the fog of victory. What does victory mean? What are our obligations once we've won? How do we clear the fog of victory? And I would propose that a brand new Geneva Convention would do just that, or at least move in that direction. The fourth reason, unregulated war fighting or unregulated war endings prolongs fighting on the ground, right? To the extent to which we don't have clear rules or expectations, belligerents will keep on fighting, jockeying for position, right? Because they lack assurances and clear rules. Fifth, we need such a convention to restrain the winners, who of course have been known to exact draconian terms of peace. World War I, a classic example. And then finally, my final great reason for arguing in favor of a new post-war Geneva Convention is that, as we all know, wars which are wrapped up badly create future wars. And so everyone needs guidance in this regard. The World Wars are a good example, the Serb Wars in the 90s, and of course the Iraq Wars as well, right? Would the second wars in each of those pairings have happened at all had the first ones been wrapped up better? Okay, so those are my reasons for a new Jus Post Bellum Geneva Convention. Now, what principles do I think should go into such a convention? Well, first, I think there's two big competing ideal types when we talk about post-war justice, at least in the Western tradition, right? And these ideal types assume victory, right? So there's the model of revenge, and there's the model of rehabilitation. And so I want to kind of give the $2 version of each of these models, but then come around to the rehabilitation model as one which I prefer. Okay, so what about the revenge model? What are the basic propositions of post-war justice that the revenge model presupposes? Well, first, they argue in favor of a public peace treaty. Second, we need an apology from the aggressor that we've defeated. Third, we need to hold war crimes trials for those responsible for committing such. Fourth, there needs to be an exchange of prisoners of war. Fifth, the aggressor ought to give up any gains that it won during the course of the war. Sixth, there needs to be some kind of demilitarization so that the aggressor can't commit aggression again in the short-term future. But then what makes it a revenge model is then sixth, right? It's thought that the aggressor has to suffer some further losses, right, as punishment, right? Now, why? Why? Well, essentially, I think this comes out of a conviction that justice just simply demands this kind of punishment and revenge, right? The aggressor started the war unjustly, right? They need to be punished for that. The gravity of that deed needs to be impressed upon them. But then also there are arguments of deterrence, right? That to the extent to which we harm their society, right, this will deter their future war-making capacity. And it may also deter other would-be aggressors from getting the same idea. Now, which kind of losses? Well, most commonly, historically, is we slap on a set of reparations payments, hefty compensations payments on defeated aggressors, right? And we give that either to ourselves or to other societies that they've victimized. And secondly, we slap sanctions on them, right, to restrict the growth of their economy, right, to punish them economically. And then essentially that's it, right? The revenge model says that's it, that's post-war justice. Let's levy those principles upon them, and then get out. We have no further responsibility for reconstruction. That's too risky, that's too costly, that's too arrogant and presumptuous. We'll leave that to the locals and leave. And two good recent-ish examples of the revenge model in action, I think, obviously the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, but then also the treaty which ended the First Persian Gulf War in 1991, I would argue, was an embodiment of the revenge paradigm as well. Now, I think that revenge is a bad policy, but I fear that the next big wars that the West gets involved in will end with the revenge model, right? Because I think there's a pendulum that swings in Western history between these two models. Are we going to impose revenge, or are we going to try to rebuild and rehabilitate? And I think because of all the difficulties in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's taking so long, it costs so much, the pendulum is going to swing back to the revenge model. And so I want to counteract that, right? I think that's bad. Revenge is a bad policy for the following reasons. One, historically, it seems to create future wars. Two, it creates new generations of enemies. Three, there's a lot of evidence that vengeful policies, especially sweeping sanctions, hurt innocent civilians. Four, I don't believe that justice demands revenge. And five, the revenge policy doesn't deal with the fact that you've still, the structural problem that you still have these bad regimes in power. And so I prefer the rehabilitation model. Now, what's the rehabilitation model? Now, first, I want to point out, in making this sweeping dichotomy between these two models, right, it's not as though there's no common ground, right? I do this for, purposes of the presentation, right? There is, I think, a Rawlsian overlapping consensus between these two models, right? So I think, for example, the rehabilitation model is also committed to the need for a public peace treaty, for demilitarization, for apologies, for an exchange of POWs, trials for war criminals, and that the aggressor give up gains. The differences are in three big things, right, between these two models, these two ideal types. First, the difference on sanctions. Rehabilitators say, no way, there's a lot of evidence that they punish innocent civilians. That violates just war principles. Right? Second, on the issue of compensation, rehabilitators say, no, reconstruction is difficult enough. Try reconstructing while you're sucking money and resources out of that country at the same time. So rehabilitators say, nope, let's not levy terms of reparations or require compensation payments either. The third difference has to do with regime change, right? The revenge model says, no, too risky, too costly, not our business. Rehabilitators suggest that it may well be worth it over the long term, right? That the long-term consequences are worth it. And of course, the big historical examples of the model of rehabilitation are the reconstruction of West Germany and Japan following the Second World War. Now, what I'd like to do next is offer kind of my 2 cents about what I think a new Geneva Convention exclusively devoted to post-war justice should include. In general, it should include 2 things. One, what's the overall goal of post-war justice, right? What should the overall goal be? And then second, what are the means that we need to achieve that goal? So first, in terms of the overall goal, I think that when we impose terms of rehabilitation on a defeated aggressor, the goal should not be a Western society or a Western liberal democracy, but what I call a minimally just society, right? And Jean mentioned things of a kind of minimally decent society yesterday in her excellent talk, and I think that there's overlapping things in that regard. And for me, a minimally just society satisfies 3 general principles. One, it's peaceful and non-aggressive internationally, right? So it's peaceful, non-aggressive internationally. Second, it is legitimate, both domestically and internationally, right? The government is recognized, freely recognized. And third, the government tries to satisfy the human rights of all of its people. I believe that human rights are genuinely universal values. I agree with David Roden and many others here, right, Michael as well, that there is near universal consensus about what kind of human rights do we actually have. My own favorite phrase, which has gone over like a lead balloon, is I argue that there's a foundational 5 human rights that kind of all of us have. The right to life or personal security, right of personal freedom, the right of material subsistence, the right of kind of non-discrimination or kind of basic elemental equality, and finally a right of social recognition as a person. These are the key values. In other words, human rights values are the core values which ought to be instantiated in any post-war reconstruction. Okay, so that's my vision of the overall goal that we should try to achieve when we're seeking to impose post-war rehabilitation. Now, what are the means to get there, right? It's one thing to be a philosopher and like Descartes and just sit there by the fire and say, oh, well, minimally just society looks great, right? Now, Rawls can do that, but I can't, right? I can't get away with doing stuff like that. So I have to talk about what are some concrete means to achieving that goal and urge their inclusion in this brand new Geneva Convention. And so I've come up with 10 things. First, adhere diligently to the laws of war during the regime takedown and its occupation. Second, purge much of the old regime and prosecute its war criminals. Third, disarm and demilitarize the society, but fourth, provide effective military and police security for the whole country. Then, work with a cross-section of locals on a new rights-respecting constitution that features checks and balances. 6, allow other non-state associations or civil society to flourish, enable it with funding. 7, forego compensation and sanctions, give that up in favor of investing in and rebuilding the economy. Next, if it's necessary, revamp educational curricula to purge past propaganda and cement new values. 9, almost done, ensure that the benefits of the new order will be concrete and widely, not narrowly distributed. And then finally, follow a public, orderly, paced exit strategy when the new regime can stand on its own 2 feet. So that's my kind of theoretical vision in general of the sorts of values that I think that a brand new Geneva Convention ought to take into account. So now I want to switch into the practical side of my presentation, focusing on Iraq and Afghanistan, and say, well, in light of these principles, what, if anything, do we still owe them? Right? Now, it seems to me that America and its allies has truly, more or less, been trying to achieve these sorts of values that I've been talking about, and to follow these steps or methods in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So how well are things going almost 10 years into it? I was talking to Peter Lee yesterday, and we all give lectures at different kinds of institutions, and I'm always shocked at when I kind of ask this question, how well is it going in Iraq? How well is it going in Afghanistan? There's this huge split in perception when you talk to military academies, military institutions, right? And when you talk to civilian universities, right? When you go to military academies, they're like, here is everything we've achieved over there. A, B, C, D, E, F, right? Talk up the success. I go to civilian institutions, and I'm sure a lot of you have the exact same experience, right? And they will hear none of it. It's all a failure. It's a hopeless failure. It's so bad we should just cut our losses and get out. Huge split in perception about how the post-war reconstruction is going. I think the correct assessment, it won't surprise you, is that there have been some successes, some excellent successes, and some real disconcerting failures. The major successes in both countries have been the replacement of aggressive, unjust, dangerous, exclusionary regimes with new, much more inclusive regimes which have democratic legitimacy through multiple elections in both societies, right? And written constitutions. So the gains in terms of both personal freedom and political legitimacy in both societies have been huge. The problem, though, is that the evidence suggests that it's not abstract things like personal freedom, political legitimacy, and gender equality which matter most to the success of post-war reconstruction. The evidence, rather, is that it is concrete things which matter the most. Jim Dobbins, whose work I would recommend to all of you, a few years ago, he was the editor of 2 terrific studies, essentially on every post-war reconstruction since the US Civil War, and focusing especially on American-led post-war reconstruction on the one hand, and then the second volume was on UN-led post-war reconstruction. Right? So I'd strongly recommend Dobbins' work to you, Dobbins. And Dobbins has given us a great concrete rule of thumb regarding post-war success, and it is this. And it is based on an analysis of all of these cases, right? So historically informed, richly empirically informed rule. He says the war-winning occupier and the new local regime have about 10 years to form an effective partnership and to make the average person feel more secure and more prosperous than they were prior to the outbreak of the war. If this happens, post-war reconstruction will succeed. If not, there will be backsliding into war. So I guess the good news is that we've still got some time in both cases, right? So if you think the Afghan regime was overthrown very early, 02, 10 years, 2012, right? And of course, Saddam is gone March, May 03, so we'd be looking at 2013 in terms of hitting the outside edges of what he thinks is a time limit. So this raises the question, does the average Afghani, does the average Iraqi feel more secure and more prosperous now than they did prior to the war? First, I want to talk about Iraq, then Afghanistan. So in Iraq, do they feel more secure? Well, after the Petraeus-led surge, obviously things are way more secure now than back in 06 when it looked like full-on civil war was going to happen. Do they feel more secure than they did under Saddam? I don't know, although I suspect the answer to that is even probably yes, right? There's no doubt the Kurds feel more secure. The Shia probably feel more secure as well. Maybe not the Sunnis, right? There's still group-on-group violence, as you all know. The groups fear US withdrawal and what will happen. But, as President Obama has recently said, America simply can't stay there forever. So the current plan, as I'm sure you all know, is that, well, combat operations in Iraq are over. There's going to be a phased withdrawal down to 50,000 US soldiers, which are going to be in Iraq indefinitely. And they are going to focus on training the Iraqi military, right? Not leaving Iraq totally, protecting remaining US personnel, and key Iraqi infrastructure, especially as it focuses around oil. What about the economy, right? Does the average Iraqi feel more prosperous than prior to the war? Well, lots of problems here. At least Iraq has the oil, though, right? So Iraq is much better off than Afghanistan. But unemployment in Iraq is shockingly high, right? UN economists estimate it to be about half. Half of the adult workforce is either unemployed or underemployed. Right? And as we all know, Iraq has essentially been constantly at war since 1979, right? Almost constantly. And so there's a ton of infrastructure damage, right? So how can you operate an economy with that kind of magnitude of infrastructure damage? So in my view, one of the things that remains to be done is that the US needs to make a substantial gesture in terms of investing in Iraq's economy, in particular in terms of the infrastructure and in terms of investment in the oil fields. What about Afghanistan? Security, does the average Afghani feel more secure, better off than prior to the war? Well, first, in terms of security, as I'm sure many of you know, the security around Kabul, the capital area, is pretty good. It's pretty good. Less so, of course, in the rural areas, right, where the warlords still dominate. They're all highly weaponized, right? They are either themselves drug dealers or in collusion with drug dealers. The border area with Pakistan is one of the most insecure spots on earth, arguably. Now, recently, there was an agreement signed in November 2010, just last November, between NATO and Afghanistan for NATO to end combat operations by 2014. And I think this is a reasonable time frame. I think the more pressing issue in Afghanistan is really the economy, right? Making the average Afghani feel more prosperous than they were prior to the war. Afghanistan, one of the poorest places on earth. There is no oil. The only thing that seems to grow there is poppies. As political scientists would say, because of the poppies and the connection to opium, Afghanistan is probably becoming a narco state with all the endemic corruption and lack of development that entails. And so obviously I think another thing that we need to do more, should do more before we get out, is invest heavily in the Afghan economy. The big difference here in Afghanistan compared to Iraq is in Iraq, essentially the Americans are on their own with a little bit of help from Britain, right? Whereas in Afghanistan, most of the Western community is in there as well, right? So for example, my country, Canada, we've built a whole range of schools for girls and women. One of the most promising things, actually just 3 weeks ago, Russia signed a huge agreement with NATO to get involved with poppy interdiction and opium interdiction, because most of the drugs that are produced in Afghanistan wind up on the streets of Moscow, right? So wow, what a great, influential, potent partner that would be, right? So drawing on that international partnership bodes well, or bodes better than doing nothing at all. Now, I'm sure you're already thinking, but what about the worst case scenario, right? So I talk about my ideals, you know, for a brand new Geneva Convention, you know, very Kantian, here's a set of rules, 10 even, 10, how presumptuous is that, right? What about the worst case scenario though, right? There have been some successes, there have been some failures. What if it all falls apart over there once we leave? Right? So what would be the worst case in Afghanistan? What would be the worst case in Iraq? Well, the worst case in Afghanistan, it seems, would be that it would become just like Vietnam, right? So we all know, once the Americans decided to get out of Vietnam, the Viet Cong took over completely within 1 year. And the takeover by North Vietnam was the very thing that America got involved in Vietnam to prevent. So that could happen in Afghanistan, right? This is totally possible that after the international community gets out of Afghanistan, the Taliban retakes control of the whole country. That would be a worst case scenario. In Iraq, of course, the worst case scenario would be that civil war would erupt between the three groups, and even worse, it would draw in external interference from nasty neighbors like Iran. How likely are these scenarios, though? Will they happen, destroying all of our efforts, making the wars completely pointless? I admit that it's possible that they might. But these worst case scenarios are unlikely if three things happen, in my view. First, the US retains a substantial, yet not occupying security presence in both countries, right? Let's not forget that after the Second World War, you know, America established bases in Japan and Germany, and they're still there. Those bases are still there, right? So I would be in support of something very similar, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? A substantial, yet not occupying security presence in both countries. The second thing that I think that needs to happen to prevent the worst case scenario is that America should switch over to a Cold War strategy stressing two things. One, containing and encircling the bad guys and using means short of war to confront them as necessity dictates, but then more importantly, enabling the good guys, many of whom are in civil society. And I have found it very profitable in my work on post-war justice to actually look for cross-fertilization with all the international development literature, right? Because as I'm sure some of you know, the whole thinking about international development has completely changed over the past 30, 40, 50 years, right? And I found it very profitable to look at, what development experts like Amartya Sen have to say about this. And so I think there's a lot of very constructive room to be played by investing heavily in civil society elements. For example, I cited Canada building schools for girls and women. There's lots of public health measures, microfinance, things of this nature, right? And we just count on the long-term efficacy of those sorts of scenarios. So a substantial yet not occupying security presence, switch over to a Cold War strategy, right, of kind of indirect pressure and enabling of the internal good guys. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, the US and its international allies should commit constructive investment and aid to these societies, contingent on their continued good governance. A little money can go a long way in the real world. And the importance of the economy is something that I think hasn't been stressed enough yet, in part because of the gravity of the security dilemmas in both societies. So I think that with about 2 more years of concentrated efforts on growing the economies, assuring the various groups that they can work together, and phasing out of combat operations, that rehabilitative post-war justice will be reasonably satisfied, and the Americans will be morally free to leave if they wish. The reality is that these efforts simply can't last forever, and Dobbins has given us a richly empirically informed timeline, 10, a dozen years, based on all the modern historical cases to keep in mind. And that's what it is. That's what it boils down to. The difference between the ideal, the reasonable, and the worst-case scenario. Ideally, Iraq and Afghanistan would turn out to be just like Japan and Germany. But we all know that this is simply not going to happen. What we have to settle for then is the reasonable, sustained efforts over a dozen years at building minimally just societies there, and a number of real successes to point at, especially regarding regime transformation. This may be the very best we can hope for in these very tough cases. In conclusion, justice is a tough job, and not a cheap one either. America and its allies are very nearly at the point of fulfilling justice's post-war requirements in Iraq and Afghanistan. We will have to settle for what Aristotle wisely called a second-best solution. But this is completely reasonable, and the worst-case scenario seems avoidable, provided that we take clearer and stronger action now during the transition out than we did 10 years ago during the transition in. Thank you so much for listening to me.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so Brian will you call on whoever. Can I ask the first question?
Please.
How should you link postbellum consideration to the ability to execute to adbellum? In other words, should it be attached to reasonable chance of success, and if you cannot do the post in some capacity, then you should go to war? Yeah. But if you want to.
Yeah, terrific. And actually, I think you even gave my answer too, Ed. So, in other words, I think I'm a big fan of Immanuel Kant, and I know a number of you are as well. And in my view, Kant began this whole discourse on Jus Post Bellum with his seminal essay, Perpetual Peace. And I think one of the most valuable contributions that he made was insistence that you think through the whole phase of the action, the whole thing, before you even begin it, right? And obviously, war has three phases. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, right? And one phrase, a charming phrase that I like in this regard, is what we need to do as just war theorists or international lawyers is tie a bright red thread of consistent moral and political values through each of these three phases, right? And so if it looks like you can't have the kind of post-war success that you were looking for, then this provides very powerful reason for you not to go down that road.
There's this very odd feature of Jus Post Bellum, which has become apparent in the past decade, and which you referred to when you said that we hope to end combat operations in Afghanistan 12 years after the end of the war. So we now face a situation where the post-bellum reconstruction, which you described very, very well, takes place while we're still fighting. And that does seem to call for some new ideas about either bellum or post-bellum.
Yes, yeah, terrific. Yeah, I always get asked this, right? You know, well, Jus Post Bellum, right? You talk about Jus Post Bellum, Orend. Well, when is the post moment, right? When does the post actually ever arrive? I can sympathize with that. Maybe the word post is the trouble, right? Obviously, there has still been armed conflict going on. So I'm not too fussy about the term, right? We all kind of know the general sort of phase or scenario that I'm talking about and the sorts of principles that I think should be operative in that phase, right? I guess my shorter answer is, you know, well, look, you know, there's day and there's night, and there's that whole transition phase of evening, and at any point in the evening, we can say, well, is it night yet? Is it night yet? Well, is it night yet? Night yet? Well, but then sooner or later, it's night. My own view with Iraq and Afghanistan is that we could talk meaningfully about post-war reconstruction as soon as the main objectives for having started the war were achieved, right? So as soon as the regimes were in fact knocked over, then we can talk about something importantly different. Whether you want to call it post-bellum, you know, the wordsmiths in the crowd can come up with a new phrase for that. But for lack of a better term, I just call it post. Jeff, please.
I have a challenge for you. I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to be able to make an objection to you that everybody makes against me.
Can you give me your answer in advance?
I'll give you the question.
I noticed that your list of post-bellum goals actually presuppose our ability to identify the side that was in the right and the side that was in the wrong. That is, your norms for Jus Post Bellum are not neutral between the side with the just cause and the side lacking a just cause. This is because you mentioned the necessity of an apology, that the aggressors surrender wrongful gains. Well, we've got to be able to tell that those gains are actually wrongful. There's also demilitarization. That's obviously not a demand that you want to impose on both sides. And actually, demilitarization suggests that you're making an assumption here that the unjust side has lost. So what are you going to say when the unjust side wins? What are the rules of Jus Post Bellum when the bad guys win? It looks like you're going to face the same challenge that I face. Two of them. First of all, are you confident that you can identify the just side, and don't you need rules that are neutral in order to be practicable, rather than rules that presuppose the identification of the good guys?
Terrific. Well, there's so much there, right? So I mean, I did. Just so you don't think, I'm ignorant or something, I mean, I did kind of say straight out that, these were kind of ideal type models that assumed victory. And so that's my first answer. I'm very aware of this problem. I guess my own view is that someone needs to write a book, and maybe I'll get off my butt and do it, a 600-page theory of post-war justice that can account for these various cases, right? So when the good guys win, have a preponderance of control in that society, here's what post-war justice might look like. What if it's the bad guys who win, right? I mean, I guess my short, cheap answer is, well, the principles in those other more difficult cases should approximate to these as close as is feasible given those sets of circumstances. But that's a short and cheap answer, right? I have found it kind of challenging enough, and I've been kind of satisfied with this so far, to just try to impress upon others the need for this kind of new separate category of postbellum justice, and I just seek to kind of be stimulating and stimulative in that regard, and then other people can gladly take up, or my future self can gladly take up the kinds of challenges that you mentioned. Please, go ahead.
From the answer, it seems like you believe that bad guys are going to follow some kinds of rules. That doesn't make sense to me. If the aggressor wins, he obviously broke the rules when he did the aggression. Now that it's over, he's going to follow some set of rules? I don't think so.
Well, yeah, and look, fair enough, right? But in a way that's kind of like saying, well, from the fact that there's going to be lawbreakers, is there a reason not to have law? Right? Sure, there's bad faith people, there's predators, there's people who won't be constrained by the rules, but we can't let the tail wag the dog, right? There's still great reasons, and I enumerated 6 or 7 right at the very start, right? Why it profits us all, right, to be mindful of the need for post-war rules.
I want to follow up on this. Maybe it would help you just to bite the bullet on these objectives and say, look, when the bad guy wins, that's the state of nature. I mean, there's no reconstruction. Why do you want to reconstruct to consolidate the aggression? I would say that the effort should be to help kick out the bad guys from war or something of that sort with the UN or whoever can do it if it can be done. But not this reconstruction thing in that case. I think I'm trying to help you.
That's great. That's great.
We're better for you to actually say these are the cases where the good guys win.
Yeah.
When the bad guy wins, all bets are off. No reconstruction. The only thing to be left here is to kick out the aggressors for the reasons that we've
Yeah, or engage in other prudential kinds of measures, right? Yeah, good. Please, go ahead.
I know we need rules, whether one is a Kantian or no, but one of the rules I think you set down was you disband the country's armed forces and their security forces when you come in, if I got that right. And I think there's a consensus that specifically the American decision to disband the Iraqi armed forces as precipitously and completely as we did was a bad mistake. So I'm worried about that being on the rule books in black and white in the new Geneva Convention, which might not account for cases sufficiently. Second question involves the 10-year mark. I'm wondering, based on the historical model, what is magic about that 10-year mark? Is it because people lose political will, they run out of resources? I mean, in operational terminology, we talk about what's called the culminating point. And that's when an attack runs out of gas, you've had too many people hurt and killed, you've lost your way, run out of ideas, the plan no longer addresses the current situation, and we start stalling. So one of the things that an operational commander has to do is to constantly defer that culminating point so that it doesn't arrive before the objective or victory. So based on what stops you at 10 years, is there a way of prolonging the life of the post-war, which might be instructive for us, for example, as we're coming up on the 10-year itch in both those places.
Right, great. Okay, so second question first. Not to put too much emphasis on the magicness of 10 years, right? Obviously, ideally, I would love to say that we ought to be there until substantive and complete success, achieving all these objectives, has been achieved, right? Ideally, absolutely. But then those ideals confront the real world, right? They do confront things like lack of political will. They do confront issues of cost, right? And I guess the magicness of it, right, is that, you know, what I'm trying to do here is kind of balance a variety of competing things, right? One of which is the fact that post-war occupation can't last forever. Otherwise, we're talking about a different thing, right? We're talking about conquest and ingurgitation of that society into your own, right? So it's got to end at some point. What point? Ideally, the substantive achievement of those principles, right? But my gesture towards realism is that that might not be possible in the hardest cases, and we have to be sensitive to that. And so, you know, it's not me who's come up with this 10 to 12 number, right? Essentially, we look at the best historical cases, right? And we try to infer from them, right? When is the culmination point, right? And people like Dobbins, I would commend the work of Dobbins to anyone in this regard. He's kind of come up with this time frame, right? And again, not rabbit out of the hat, right? But based on rigorous analysis of all the post-Civil War Reconstruction, saying, look, if it's firmly entrenched by 10 years, it's probably going to work. If it hasn't been, historical odds say, overwhelmingly, backsliding into war, right? But that's only historical best evidence, right? I'm not saying, well, hey, right at the 10-year, 12-year mark, you know, I'm just saying ish, to try to be some kind of concrete action guidingness, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we have to stop, but thank you for such a rich talk, and thank you for your generosity. This is the second time Brian has come to